There is something about stone and earth, something about the way they rise from the ground with such deliberate purpose that draws the mind into a particular kind of stillness. I find myself thinking about walls tonight, not the walls we know from our ordinary days, but walls built across centuries, walls that have stood through seasons beyond counting, walls that were raised with the slow accumulation of human thought and human labor. And as I consider them, I notice how they seem to exist in a place between the practical and the monumental, between the necessary and the eternal. Fortifications, the word itself carries weight, carries the impression of stone settling into earth, of moats reflecting clouded skies, of towers rising into the pale light of dawn. And when I let my thoughts move across the long history of these structures, I find myself in the presence of something vast and quiet, something that unfolds across landscapes and across time with a patience that matches the pace of glaciers, of rivers cutting through rock. Tonight, I want to walk through that history, not hurrying, but letting each image emerge in its own time. The way mist rises from a valley floor, or the way shadows lengthen across a courtyard as the sun makes its slow arc overhead. There is a castle I'm imagining, though it could be any of 1,000 castles, any of the fortresses that dot the old landscapes of the world. And in my mind, I approach it from a distance, across fields that might be golden with late summer grain, or gray-green with the first cold rains of autumn, and from this distance the walls seem almost to grow from the landscape itself, as if they were a natural formation, a cliff face, an outcropping of the bones of the earth. But as I draw nearer, the intentionality reveals itself, the way the stones have been cut and placed, the way the towers punctuate the sky at measured intervals, the way the whole structure seems to breathe with human purpose, with the accumulated decisions of masons and architects and military engineers, of lords and laborers, of generations who looked at this same stone and saw protection, saw power, saw home. The air around such places feels different, even in imagination. There is a quality of weight, of presence, as if the stones themselves hold memory, hold the echo of footsteps on spiral stairs, the murmur of voices in great halls, the silence of watchmen staring out across moonlit approaches. And I find myself wondering, where does such a thing begin? This impulse to fortify, to build barriers between the vulnerable interior and the uncertain exterior, to shape the earth and stone into bulwarks and bastions, into ramparts and redoubts. The history reaches back beyond memory, beyond written record, into the deep time when humans first understood that height offered advantage, that thickness offered safety, that a well-placed wall could mean the difference between survival and dissolution. And from those first simple earthworks, those first piled stones and sharpened stakes, there emerged over millennia a science and an art, a discipline of thought that married geometry to geography, that understood angles and fields of fire, that could read a landscape and see not just hills and rivers, but opportunities and vulnerabilities. I think of the first fortifications as simple things, rings of earth, ditches and embankments, timber palisades rising from cleared ground, and I can almost see the hands that shaped them, working in the long light of summer evenings, pausing to wipe sweat from brows, to drink from clay vessels, to look up at the emerging structure and feel perhaps a certain satisfaction, a certain sense that tomorrow would be safer than yesterday. But simplicity in the story of fortifications is only the beginning, because what starts as a circle of stakes becomes, over the patient centuries, something far more complex, far more refined, until eventually the walls and towers stand as expressions of the deepest knowledge of their age, incorporating mathematics and engineering, hydraulics and metallurgy, geology and psychology, all woven together in stone and mortar, in earth and timber, in the careful calculation of angles and the strategic placement of the gates. Tonight, as I let my thoughts move through this history, I feel no urgency. There is time, all the time required to watch these structures rise in the mind's eye, to see how a simple ditch becomes a moat, how a timber wall becomes a curtain of stone, how a watchtower grows into a keep, and how the keep becomes the heart of something larger, a complex, a system, a small city unto itself, protected and provisioned, designed to endure. And in that endurance there is something quietly magnificent, something that speaks to the long view, to the understanding that a wall built well might serve not just the builder, but the builder's children and their children, across generations that stretch into a future the original architect could never see, but could, in some essential way, imagine. The earliest fortifications rose from necessity, from the moment when human beings ceased their wandering and chose to remain in one place, to cultivate the earth, to store grain, to accumulate the things that made life more secure but also more vulnerable. And with that choice came the recognition that what could be accumulated could also be taken, that prosperity invited attention, invited those who might come not to trade, but to seize. In the ancient river valleys, in Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates traced their patient paths through lands that would become the cradle of so much, the first city walls appeared as if they were as natural as agriculture itself, as necessary as irrigation. The city of Uruk, its name still carrying the sound of deep time, raised walls of mud brick that enclosed temples and dwellings, markets and granaries, and these walls, though they seem simple to us now, represented a profound shift in human thinking, a commitment to place, a declaration that here we stand, here we remain. The walls of Uruk stretched for nearly 6 miles in a great circuit, and they rose perhaps 20 feet or more, built from millions upon millions of bricks dried in the relentless sun, each brick shaped by hand, each brick placed with intention, and I imagine the work, the long lines of laborers, the rhythm of construction that must have become as familiar as the rhythm of planting and harvest, the slow accumulation of height and mass, day after day, season after season, until the wall stood complete, a boundary between the ordered world within and the uncertain expanse beyond. But mud brick, for all its availability, for all the ease with which it could be shaped and stacked, had its limitations. It eroded under rain, crumbled under assault, required constant maintenance, constant attention, and so the search began, the long experimental process of finding better materials, stronger configurations, more enduring solutions to the problem of protection, stone, where it could be quarried, where it could be moved, offered permanence that mud brick could never match. And in the lands around the Mediterranean, in Egypt and Greece, in the hills of Anatolia, stone walls began to rise, walls that would outlast empires, that would stand as ruins for millennia after the cities they protected had fallen silent. The Egyptians were, just with their profound understanding of stone, built fortresses along the Nile, great rectangular structures with massive walls that seem almost to merge with the cliffs and desert from which they emerged. These were not the pyramids, not the temples, but they shared something of that monumental character, that sense of building for eternity, and they served to protect the trade routes, to control the borders, to project power into Nubia and beyond. In these early fortresses, we begin to see the principles that would guide military architecture for thousands of years. The understanding that walls should be thick, so thick that siege engines could not easily breach them, that corners should be reinforced, that gates, those necessary vulnerabilities, should be protected by flanking towers, by multiple barriers, by designs that forced attackers into narrow channels where they could be observed, could be engaged, could be stopped. The Hittites, in their mountainous homeland, built fortifications that worked with the landscape, walls that followed the contours of hilltops, that incorporated natural rock formations into their defensive schemes. And they developed the casemate wall, a double wall with the space between filled with rubble or divided into chambers, creating thickness without the need for solid masonry throughout, a clever economy of means that achieves strength through geometry rather than through sheer mass alone. And then there were the Greeks, who brought to fortification the same intellectual rigor they brought to philosophy and mathematics, who understood walls not just as barriers, but as systems, as integrated designs where each element served multiple purposes, supported multiple functions. The walls of Mycenae, built in the late Bronze Age, were constructed of stones so massive that later Greeks believed they must have been placed by the Cyclops, by giants, because how else could such enormous blocks have been moved and fitted together? These walls, built without mortar, relied on the precise shaping of stone, on the careful selection of each piece, on the understanding that weight and friction could create a bond as strong as any mortar, could create walls that would stand for 3,000 years and more. But it was in the classical period, in the 5th and 4th centuries before the Common Era, that Greek military engineering reached its height. Chengshi states like Athens built long walls connecting the city to its port at Piraeus, creating a protected corridor miles in length, ensuring that even under siege, the city could be supplied by sea, could endure, and these walls incorporated towers at regular intervals, postern gates for sorties, all the refinements that centuries of warfare had taught. The Greeks understood enfilade, the principle that walls should be designed so that defenders could bring fire along the face of the wall, could support each other, could create overlapping fields of observation and engagement, and they built their towers to project outward from the wall line, creating angles from which archers and javelin throwers could strike at enemies attempting to approach or scale the walls. And they understood the importance of the ditch, the simple excavation that made walls effectively higher, that created an obstacle that must be crossed under fire, that collected the debris of siege warfare and made the approach ever more difficult, ever more deadly. The technology of siege warfare in these early centuries was developing in parallel with the technology of fortification, battering rams, siege towers, scaling ladders. each innovation in attack prompting a refinement in defense, each breach teaching a lesson that would be incorporated into the next generation of walls. The Phoenicians, those masters of the sea, fortified their coastal cities with walls that rose directly from the water's edge, walls that could be supplied and reinforced by ship, even when landward approaches were cut off. Tyre, built on an island, seemed almost impregnable, its walls rising from the sea, its harbors protected by chains and naval power, and when Alexander the Great laid siege to it, he was forced to build a causeway across the water to bring his siege engines within range, a feat of engineering that took months, that cost thousands of lives, and that demonstrated both the power of well-designed fortifications and the terrible determination required to overcome them. In China, across those vast distances, fortifications were developing along their own path, shaped by different materials, different threats, different philosophies of warfare and defense. The early Chinese fortifications, built during the Warring States period, used rammed earth, layer upon layer of soil compacted between wooden forms, creating walls of surprising strength and durability, walls that could rise to great heights, that could extend for miles, that required armies of workers, but could be built with local materials, with nothing more than earth and human labor. These walls incorporated wooden platforms for defenders, crenellations for cover, gates protected by multiple chambers and overlapping fields of fire, and they began the tradition that would culminate centuries later in the Great Wall, in that extraordinary expression of defensive ambition that would stretch across mountains and deserts, across the northern frontier of an empire, but that great synthesis still lay in the future. In these early centuries, fortifications remained primarily local, protecting individual cities, individual communities, designed for sieges that might last weeks or months, but not for the kind of sustained campaigns that would characterize later ages. The Romans, when they emerged as a military power, inherited all of this accumulated knowledge, Greek geometry, Phoenician engineering, Etruscan masonry, and they systematized it, they codified it, turned the art of fortification into a science that could be taught, that could be replicated across an empire that would eventually stretch from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara. Roman military camps, even temporary ones, were fortified according to strict geometric principles, rectangular layouts, ramparts and ditches, gates positioned at the cardinal points, streets laid out in a grid, every camp a small fortified city, every city an expression of Roman order imposed upon the landscape. And these camps, these castra, gave their name to countless towns and cities across Europe: Chester, Lancaster, Manchester, Winchester, each name carrying the echo of Roman fortification, of Roman presence. The Romans understood logistics, understood that fortifications were not just about walls and towers, but about supply lines, about roads, about the ability to move troops and materiel rapidly, to concentrate force where it was needed, to maintain communication across vast distances. And so they built roads that were themselves defensive works, raised causeways that could be defended, that could serve as barriers, that connected fortified towns and military stations in a network of mutual support. Their frontier fortifications, the great limes that marked the edges of the empire, were not continuous walls, not at first, but chains of forts and watchtowers. signal stations that could relay messages across hundreds of miles in a matter of hours, using fire and smoke, using the patient system of observation and communication that allowed a relatively small number of troops to monitor and control vast stretches of border. Hadrian's Wall, when it was built in the 2nd century of the Common Era, represented perhaps the fullest expression of this philosophy. 73 miles of stone barrier stretching across the narrowest part of northern Britain, from sea to sea, with a fortified gate every Roman mile, with watchtowers between, with a massive ditch to the north and a military road to the south, and behind the wall, a network of forts housing garrisons, each fort capable of sending reinforcements to any threatened section, each connected by that road, that vital artery of communication and supply. I imagine the construction, the years of labor, the quarrying of stone from the local outcrops, the shaping and dressing of blocks, the mixing of mortar from lime and sand, the slow accumulation of courses, rising from the foundation trenches, growing taller week by week, season by season, and the soldiers who built it. For Roman soldiers were also engineers, also laborers, spending their years of service not just in battle, but in construction, in the patient work of building the infrastructure of empire. The wall itself was perhaps 15 feet high in most places, though sections varied, and it was backed by an earthen rampart fronted by that great ditch, 30 feet wide and 15 feet deep in places, cut through solid rock where necessary, and every element served a purpose. The ditch delayed attackers, made them vulnerable as they descended and climbed. The wall provided height and protection. The rampart allowed defenders to move quickly along the wall's length, and the whole system created a barrier that was as much psychological as physical, a statement of Roman power, of Roman permanence. But the Middle Ages, the centuries that followed the fall of Rome, would bring fortification to its highest development, would create the castles and city walls that still populate our imagination, that still stand, often enough, as monuments to an age when stone and earth were the primary materials of power. The early medieval fortifications in the centuries immediately following Rome's collapse were often simple affairs, motta and bailey castles, a raised mound of earth topped by a wooden tower, surrounded by a courtyard enclosed by timber palisades. These could be built quickly, could be built with local resources and labor, and they spread across the landscape of post-Roman Europe like seeds scattered on fertile ground, thousands of them, marking the domains of lords great and small, establishing centers of control in a fragmenting world. The moat, that artificial hill, could be raised in a matter of months if enough workers were available, earth excavated from a surrounding ditch, piled and compacted, shaped into a truncated cone perhaps 30 or 40 feet high, with a flat top where the tower would stand, and from that height a defender could see across the surrounding countryside, could spot approaching danger, could ring a bell or light a beacon to warn the settlements that lay under the Lord's protection. But wood burns, wood rots, and as wealth accumulated, as techniques improved, as ambitions grew, stone began to replace timber, first in the tower, the keep, and then in the walls that surrounded the bailey, that protected the workshops and stables, the granaries and wells, all the infrastructure of a fortified lordship. The great stone keeps that rose in the 11th and 12th centuries. Structures like the White Tower in London, like the Keep at Rochester, like Chateau Gaillard in Normandy, were massive, monumental buildings that required years to construct, that consumed vast quantities of stone and lime, that employed dozens or hundreds of skilled masons and laborers. And they were designed not just to resist assault, but to dominate, to awe, to serve as visible symbols of power that could be seen for miles across the landscape. The walls of these keeps were enormously thick, 10 feet, 12 feet, even 15 feet in places, solid stone or rubble filled, and they rose to heights of 80, 90, even 100 feet, topped by crenellated battlements where defenders could shelter behind merlons, could loose arrows or drop stones through machicolations, those projecting galleries with holes in their floors that allowed defenders to strike at enemies directly below. Inside, the keep was divided into levels, the lowest often used for storage, for cisterns that could hold water through months of siege, the middle levels for living quarters, for the great hall where the Lord would hold court and feast, and the upper levels for private chambers and for the battlements, and connecting these levels, spiral staircases, always turning clockwise as one ascended, so that a defender retreating upward would have his sword arm free, while an attacker climbing would find his sword arm blocked by the central pillar, every detail considered, every element designed with both daily life and desperate defense in mind. The entrance to a keep was never at ground level. It was reached by an external stair, often of wood, that could be removed or burned in time of siege, leading to a door on the second level, and that door, that critical vulnerability, was protected by layers of defense, by iron-bound oak several inches thick, by a portcullis, a heavy wooden or iron grating that could be dropped to block the passage, by murder holes above where defenders could rain down projectiles on anyone attempting to force entry, and beyond the keep, the castle grew more complex. Curtain walls connected towers, creating an enclosed space, the ward, where daily life of the castle community unfolded, where the chapel stood, where the kitchens sent up their smoke, where the smithy rang with the sound of a hammer on anvil, where horses were stabled and armor maintained, and all of this protected by those walls, those towers, that whole system of defense that had evolved over centuries of hard experience. The towers themselves became more sophisticated. Early towers were square, but attackers learned to undermine corners, to collapse them through sapping, through digging tunnels beneath and burning away the supporting timbers, and so towers became round or polygonal, shapes that resisted mining, that had no corners to exploit, and they were placed at intervals along the curtain wall, close enough that defenders in one tower could support those in the next, could create that overlapping fire, that mutual protection that was the key to effective defense. Concentric fortification, the principle of defense in depth, emerged as perhaps the highest expression of the medieval military architecture. Castles like Crac des Chevaliers in Syria, built by the Crusaders, or Beaumaris in Wales, built by Edward I, featured multiple rings of walls, each higher than the one before, so that defenders on the inner walls could fire over the heads of those on the outer walls, so that an attacker who breached the first wall would find himself trapped in a narrow space, a killing ground overlooked by higher fortifications, with no easy retreat and no clear path forward. The gatehouses of these great castles became fortresses in themselves, massive structures with multiple portcullises, with doors that opened inward so they could not be battered from their hinges, with passages that turned at right angles, forcing attackers to slow, to bunch up, to expose themselves to fire from arrow loops, from murder holes, from every clever device that medieval engineers could devise. Water defenses, moats, were not just obstacles but integral parts of the defensive system. They prevented mining, prevented the rolling of siege towers close to the walls, and they could be fed by rivers, by springs, or simply by rainfall collected in the natural depression that surrounded the castle mound. And in some cases, these moats were elaborate, with sluice gates that could control water levels, with drawbridges that could be raised to isolate the castle completely from the surrounding land. The science of fortification in this period was transmitted through practical experience, through the movement of master masons and military engineers from project to project, from kingdom to kingdom, and through the careful observation of what worked, of what failed. Every siege taught lessons. Every successful defense was studied and emulated. Every breach led to refinements in design. The castles of the Levant, built during the Crusades, incorporated lessons learned from Byzantine and Islamic fortifications, designs that had evolved in regions where siege warfare was ancient and sophisticated. And these lessons traveled back to Europe, influenced the construction of castles in France and England, in Germany and Spain, creating a gradual convergence of technique, a shared vocabulary of defensive architecture that transcended cultural and political boundaries. By the 13th century, the high point of castle building in Europe, the principles were well established. Thick walls, round towers, concentric defense, protected gateways, all supported by careful attention to supply, to water, to the ability to endure months of isolation, and the great castle building projects of this era. Edward I's ring of fortresses in Wales, the Teutonic Knights' brick castles in Prussia, the Moorish alcazabas of Andalusia represented the culmination of centuries of development, structures so formidable that they shaped the political geography of their regions, determined the outcomes of wars and rebellions, stood as the ultimate expression of feudal power. But even as these great castles reached their zenith, even as they stood seemingly impregnable upon their heights, change was coming, carried on the wind of new technologies, new methods of warfare that would transform the nature of fortification as profoundly as stone had once transformed timber. Gunpowder, that mixture of saltpeter and sulfur and charcoal, had been known in China for centuries, used for fireworks, for signals, for rockets that traced fiery arcs across night skies. But in the 13th and 14th centuries, it began its westward journey, carried along the Silk Roads, transmitted through Arabic texts, and arriving in Europe at a moment when metallurgy and mechanical engineering had reached a level that could turn this curious powder into a weapon of devastating potential. The early cannons were crude things, wrought iron tubes bound with hoops, as likely to burst and kill their operators as to harm the enemy. But they could throw stone balls against walls, could create noise and smoke that terrified defenders, and more importantly, they represented a new principle. The principle that walls could be broken not by patient undermining, not by starvation and time, but by direct, repeated, violent impact. By the 15th century, Cannons had become larger, more reliable, more powerful, and the great siege guns, bombards like Mons Meg in Scotland, or the Turkish guns that reduced the walls of Constantinople, could throw stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds, could create breaches in medieval walls that had stood for centuries, and suddenly the whole accumulated wisdom of defensive architecture seemed inadequate, seemed vulnerable. Constantinople, that city which had withstood sieges for more than 1,000 years, which had turned back Arabs and Bulgars, Avars and Rus, which was protected by the greatest walls of the medieval world, triple walls rising from the edge of Europe, fell in 1453, fell to the Ottoman Turks, whose cannons, whose massive bronze guns cast by Hungarian engineers, pounded the ancient masonry into rubble, created breaches through which the Janissaries could pour. And the fall of Constantinople marked not just the end of Byzantium, not just a shift in political power, but the end of an era in military architecture. The response, the adaptation to gunpowder, came gradually at first. Walls were made thicker, were backed with earth that could absorb the impact of cannonballs. Towers were lowered, made squatter, less prominent as targets, and gunports were added, openings through which defenders could fire their own artillery, could answer cannon with cannon. But the real transformation came in Italy in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, where a new system of fortification emerged, the Tres Italien, the Italian style, a complete reimagining of defensive architecture for the age of gunpowder. And this system would spread across Europe, would be refined and elaborated, would remain the dominant form of fortification for more than 3 centuries. The key innovation was the bastion, a low, thick projection from the main wall, shaped like an arrow point or a diamond, designed so that every face of the fortification could be covered by flanking fire from adjacent bastions, so that there were no dead zones, no places where attackers could shelter from defensive guns. The whole perimeter became a killing ground, a mathematical exercise in geometry and ballistics. These new fortifications were lower than medieval walls, presenting less of a target, but they were far thicker, sometimes 60 or 80 feet of earth and masonry, sloped on the outside so that cannonballs would strike at an angle, would lose energy, would be deflected rather than penetrating, and they were surrounded by deep ditches, by glacis, those long earthen slopes that exposed attackers to fire, that prevented them from approaching under cover. The fortifications of this new age required enormous resources, vast amounts of earth to be moved, brick and stone in quantities that dwarfed even the great medieval castles, and they required a new kind of specialist, the military engineer, trained in mathematics and surveying, in the principles of geometry and the properties of materials. Men like Vauban in France, who would spend their careers designing fortresses, planning sieges, writing treatises that codified the science of fortification and attack. Sébastien Leprestre de Vauban, perhaps the greatest military engineer of the 17th century, designed or modified more than 300 fortifications during his long service to Louis XIV, and his systems, his careful calculations of angles and distances, his understanding of how to create fields of fire, of how to protect gates and salients, became the standard against which all later fortifications were measured. A Vauban fortress was a thing of geometric beauty, star-shaped, with bastions at each point, with ravelins, those detached triangular works, protecting the curtain walls between bastions, with covered ways along the tops of the earthen glacis, where defenders could move unseen, with counterguards and hornworks and crownworks, a whole vocabulary of defensive elements, each designed to serve a specific purpose, each integrated into a comprehensive system. Walking through the plans of such a fortress, tracing the angles on paper or in the imagination, one can almost feel the logic, the careful thought that went into every element, the way each bastion supports its neighbors, the way the glacis forces attackers to advance across open ground, the way the ditch, often dry now, was deep enough to stop a rush, wide enough to keep siege batteries at a distance, and the way the whole design assumes a defender who is active, who will sally forth to disrupt siege works, who will use interior lines to shift forces to threatened points. These fortifications shape the landscape of Europe. Great fortified cities like Luxembourg, Lille, Turin, Nancy, cities where the star-shaped walls determined the pattern of streets, limited growth, created a clear boundary between the military zone and the civilian town, and on frontiers, chains of fortresses controlled territory, dominated river crossings, protected borders, turned warfare into a slow, methodical contest of sieges and maneuvers, rather than the decisive battles that commanders often sought. The 18th century saw the refinement of these systems, saw the codification of siege warfare into a formal art, with prescribed approaches and parallels, with the patient digging of trenches ever closer to the walls, with the placement of batteries at calculated distances, the whole siege becoming almost ritualized, following rules that both attackers and defenders understood, and often a fortress would surrender once a practical breach had been made, once the forms had been observed, rather than enduring the final assault that might reduce the fortification to rubble and the garrison to casualties. But even as this system reached its height, even as military engineers created ever more elaborate defenses, new challenges were emerging: rifled artillery with greater range and accuracy, explosive shells that could destroy masonry more effectively than solid shot, and eventually the Industrial Revolution, which would bring iron and steel, concrete, and reinforced earth, and would transform fortification yet again. The 19th century saw a gradual move away from masonry fortifications toward designs that emphasized earth, that used the landscape itself as protection. Forts were built low, were camouflaged, were designed to present minimal targets to the improved artillery, and they began to incorporate armored elements, rotating turrets of iron and later steel, protected gun positions that could withstand direct hits, magazines buried deep underground where powder and shell could be stored safely even under bombardment. The fortresses built around European cities in the mid to late 1800s, the rings of detached forts that surrounded Paris, Antwerp, Verdun, represented a new philosophy. No longer was the fortification meant to protect the entire city behind continuous walls. Instead, it created a defensive zone, a belt of strong points that could delay an attacker, that could provide bases for a mobile defense, that acknowledged the reality that no fixed fortification could withstand indefinitely the artillery of the industrial age. And yet, fortification did not end, did not become obsolete. Instead, it adapted once more, went underground, became the trenches of the First World War, those lines that stretched from the Channel to Switzerland, protected by barbed wire, by machine guns, by artillery zeroed in on every approach. And in those trenches, in those dugouts and bunkers, the principles were still recognizable, still the same fundamental ideas that had governed fortification since ancient times: the use of earth for protection, the importance of fields of fire, the need for supply and communication, the patience required to endure bombardment and wait for the moment to respond. The concrete bunkers of the Atlantic Wall, of the Maginot Line, of the countless fortified positions that marked the Second World War were descendants of those ancient walls, of those medieval keeps, adapted for new weapons, new tactics, but still serving the same essential purpose: creating protected space, establishing control of terrain, allowing a smaller force to resist a larger one, buying time, preserving strength. And even now, in our own age, fortification continues. In the blast walls around sensitive installations, in the hardened command posts buried beneath mountains, in the sophisticated systems that protect against missiles and drones, the impulse remains, the understanding that protection, that the creation of defended space remains a fundamental requirement, a constant, in the long story of human conflict and human society. But to think of fortifications only as military structures, only as tools of war and defense, is to miss something essential, something that speaks to deeper currents in human nature and human culture. There is in a fortification a kind of dialogue with time, with the future. The builder of a wall is making a statement that extends beyond the immediate present, beyond the threat of a next season's campaign. It is an assertion that this place will endure, that it matters enough to protect, that the labor and treasure invested today will pay dividends across generations, yet unborn. I think of the masons who cut stone for Hadrian's Wall, who would never see the completed work, who labored on a section that was part of a vast whole extending beyond their sight, beyond their lifetime, and yet they cut each stone true, fitted each block with care, because the work itself demanded it, because there was dignity in building something meant to outlast empires. The great fortifications are monuments to patience, to the willingness to think in terms of decades, of centuries. A castle might take 20 years to build, a city wall system 50 years or more, and during all that time, resources must be found, labor must be organized, the vision must be maintained through the reign of multiple lords, through wars and famines, through all the contingencies that threaten long-term projects. And there is something in the very form of fortifications, in their geometry and massing, that speaks to the human response to vulnerability. The circle, the square, the star, these are primal shapes, shapes that appear in art and architecture across cultures, across time. And when they appear in fortifications, they carry meanings beyond the merely practical. A curtain wall enclosing a space creates an interior and an exterior, creates the distinction between inside and outside that is fundamental to so much human thought, to our sense of self and other, of civilization and wilderness, of order and chaos, and the gate, that controlled opening, becomes a threshold, a liminal space where these categories meet and mingle, where the merchant and the stranger, the messenger and the refugee, pass from one realm to another under the watchful eyes of those who guard the boundary. The tower rising above the horizontal plane, asserting verticality, is an ancient symbol of aspiration, of the desire to see farther, to rise above the immediate. And in a fortification, towers serve the practical purpose of extending vision, of providing platforms for observation and fire, but they also serve a symbolic function. They announce presence. They claim the skyline. They say to all who approach that here is power, here is authority, here is a place that watches and waits. I find myself thinking about the aesthetic dimension of fortifications, about the fact that so many of them, even those built in desperate times with limited resources, display a concern for proportion, for harmony, for beauty. The walls of medieval cities often incorporated decorative elements, carved gates, towers with elegant proportions, crenellations that created rhythmic patterns against the sky, as if the builders understood that a fortification was not just a military necessity, but a statement about the community it protected, about their values, their identity, their sense of themselves as makers of enduring things. The great Vauban fortresses, with their perfect geometry, their star shapes inscribed across the landscape, are beautiful in a severe mathematical way, beautiful in the manner of a theorem or a fugue, where every element follows from first principles, where form and function achieve a kind of unity that transcends the original military purpose. And many of these fortifications, no longer needed for defense, now serve as parks, as historic sites, as places where people walk and contemplate the layers of time, the succession of walls and earthworks that tell the story of changing technologies, changing threats, changing conceptions of space and power. There is a melancholy in ruins, in the abandoned fortresses that dot the landscapes of the old world. Towers open to the sky, walls breached by time and weather rather than by siege. And these ruins speak to the inevitable arc of all human works, the recognition that even the strongest walls, the most carefully planned defenses, cannot hold back forever. The patient erosion of the centuries cannot prevent the moment when the garrison departs, when the gates stand open, when ivy begins its slow climb up the masonry. And yet there is also a kind of triumph in these ruins, a testament to the skill of the builders, to the durability of their work, that even in decay, even reduced to fragments, the walls still stand, still mark the landscape, still carry the memory of what they were, of the hands that built them, the lives that sheltered behind them. I think of all the people who have lived within fortified spaces, who have known walls not as abstractions, not as military architecture, but as the familiar backdrop of daily life, children who played in the shadow of towers, merchants who set up stalls in fortified market squares, soldiers who paced the walls through long night watches, families who sheltered in keeps during times of danger. And for all these people, the fortification was not primarily a military installation. It was home. It was the shape of their world, the boundary of the known and safe. The communities that grew within walls developed distinctive characters, distinctive cultures, shaped by that enclosure, by the need to use space efficiently, by the mixing of different classes and crafts within a limited area, and the walls themselves became gathering places, sites of processions and festivals, places where lovers met in the evening, where old men sat and watched the sun set over the lands beyond. And I think, too, about the knowledge embedded in fortifications, the accumulated experience of generations of builders and defenders, the understanding of materials, of earth mechanics, of geometry, of human psychology. All of this knowledge preserved not in books, not in formal education, but in the structures themselves, in the patterns that proved successful, in the designs that were copied and adapted across regions and centuries. A master mason in the 13th century, building a castle, carried in his mind a library of techniques, of solutions to problems, of proportions and methods, and he passed this knowledge to his apprentices, who would in turn become masters, who would build their own walls and towers, each generation adding refinements, solving new problems, preserving and extending the tradition until the coming of gunpowder disrupted the continuity, forced a reimagining of everything, and then the tradition rebuilt itself, adapted, continued in new forms. The story of fortifications is in many ways the story of human ingenuity applied to the problem of security, of safety, but it is also the story of how we shape space, how we create boundaries, how we express through stone and earth our deepest concerns, our need for protection, our desire for permanence, our understanding that we are vulnerable, and that through collective effort, through planning and patience, we can create structures that extend our power, that multiply our strength, that allow us to endure. And so tonight, as my thoughts trace the long arc of walls and towers, of ditches and bastions, of all the elaborate defenses that humanity has raised across the ages, I find myself not thinking of war, not thinking of conflict, but of the quiet moments, the morning light on ancient stones, the sound of wind through empty embrasures, the patience of walls waiting through centuries, and the sense that in these structures, in their endurance and their ruin, there is something that speaks to us still, something about our nature, about our hopes and fears, about the long conversation between human aspiration and human limitation that plays out across the landscape, across time, the castle on the hill, the fortress walls enclosing the old town, the earthwork rising from the plain. These are not just relics, not just tourist attractions or military history. They are monuments to a particular kind of human effort, to the willingness to invest in the future, to build beyond the needs of the moment, to create something that just might endure. And there is comfort in that, in the evidence that stone and earth, carefully placed, thoughtfully designed, can stand for centuries, for millennia, can outlast kingdoms and empires, can carry forward through time the mark of human presence, human purpose, human care. The walls may crumble, the towers may fall, but slowly, so slowly, giving ground only grudgingly to the patient work of wind and rain and frost. And in that stubbornness, in that resistance to time, there is a kind of courage, a kind of defiance that feels appropriate, feels right. I imagine walking through an old fortress at dusk, when the tourists have departed, when the guides have gone home, when the stones hold the last warmth of the sun and the shadows deepen in the corners, in the arrow loops, in the passages that wind through the thickness of the walls. And there is a quietness, a sense of accumulated time, of all the moments that have passed in this place, all the footsteps on these stairs, all the hands that have touched these stones. And in that quietness, in that gathering dusk, the fortification reveals itself not as a monument to war, but as a monument to human persistence, to the long effort of building and maintaining, of defending and preserving, of creating spaces where life could continue, where communities could grow, where children could be born and raised in safety, where the work of civilization, the slow accumulation of knowledge and culture, could proceed under the protection of walls. The light fades, the stars emerge one by one above the battlements, and the old stones settle into darkness. Patient as always, waiting as they have waited through so many nights, so many seasons, holding their place, marking the boundary between earth and sky, between past and present, between the human desire for order and the vast indifference of time. And in that waiting, in that patient endurance, there is something like peace, something like rest, something that allows the mind to settle, to find its own quietness, its own stillness, as the night deepens and the walls stand and the world turns slowly toward morning. There is something about the way light falls across a canvas, something about the stillness of a studio in the early hours, when the world outside has not yet begun to move. And inside these quiet rooms, painters once stood before their easels, brushes poised, contemplating color and shadow and the infinite possibilities of what might emerge from nothing more than pigment and linseed oil. I find myself walking through the 19th century tonight, not as it existed in the rush of industry and empire, but as it lived in the studios of those who devoted themselves to capturing it, frame by frame, stroke by stroke, building entire worlds with their hands. The air in these imagined spaces feels different somehow, thick with the scent of turpentine and beeswax, dust motes suspended in shafts of northern light streaming through tall windows, the kind of light that painters prized above all else, steady and cool and unchanging throughout the long hours of work. I can almost see the worn floorboards, paint spattered and uneven, the tables cluttered with tubes of color squeezed and twisted, their metal bodies bearing the marks of countless applications, ochre and umber and vermilion and cobalt, names that sound like poetry when spoken slowly, each one a gateway to a different quality of seeing. These painters, these remarkable individuals who lived between 1790 and 1900, they witnessed a world transforming at unprecedented speed, railways cutting through countryside that had remained unchanged for centuries, cities swelling beyond recognition, photography emerging to challenge everything painting had been. And yet they continued day after day, returning to their canvases with a kind of devotion that borders on the sacred. There were so many of them, each with their own vision, their own understanding of what it meant to translate the visible world into something that could live forever on a flat surface. Some worked in sun-drenched fields, others in cluttered Parisian apartments, still others in grand ateliers where students gathered to learn the old techniques, the traditional methods passed down through generations. Tonight I want to walk among them, to move slowly through their world, to understand not just what they painted, but how they saw, what drew their eye, what made them choose one shade of green over another, one angle of light instead of the next. Because in these choices, in these thousands upon thousands of small decisions, entire philosophies of beauty were born. The century itself seems to unfold like a long gallery, room after room of different approaches, different schools of thought, beginning with those who painted in the grand manner, the history painters and portraitists who commanded enormous canvases and royal commissions, their work lit by candlelight in the salons of Europe, admired by crowds who came to see art that told stories, that elevated and educated and impressed. And then, gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, something began to shift. Painters started turning away from mythology and biblical scenes. They began looking instead at the world immediately around them, the ordinary made extraordinary through attention, through care, through the simple act of seeing what had always been there, but had somehow remained invisible. I think of the light in their studios again, how it must have changed throughout the day. Morning brightness giving way to afternoon's golden warmth, then evening's violet shadows, and how a painter working on the same canvas across weeks or months would have seen it transform under these different conditions, would have had to make choices about which light was the truest, which version of reality to preserve. There is something profound in this, in the way these artists devoted entire lifetimes to the problem of representation, to the question of how to make paint on canvas feel alive, feel true, feel like more than just colored mud spread across woven fabric. And so I begin this slow journey, this unhurried exploration of their world, knowing that each painter I encounter will offer a different answer to the same fundamental questions. What is worth painting? How should it be painted? And what can art reveal that we might otherwise miss in the blur of simply living? The 19th century awaits, vast and varied, filled with more beauty and innovation than any single telling could capture. But here in this quiet space, with time moving at its own gentle pace, perhaps we can glimpse something of what these remarkable individuals saw and understood, and gave to us through their patient, persistent, transformative work. The century opens with painters still working in the long shadow of the past, still looking to Rome and Athens for their subjects, still believing that the highest calling of art was to depict gods and heroes, moments of classical virtue frozen in time, rendered with the precision and clarity that academies across Europe demanded of their students. In France, in those early years after the Revolution, Jacques-Louis David Hub commanded enormous influence, his studio in Paris a place where young artists gathered to learn the principles of neoclassicism, that style which prized order above all else, rational composition, clear lines, subjects drawn from history and mythology, everything calculated to inspire civic virtue and moral certainty. David's canvases from this period possess a kind of theatrical clarity, every figure positioned with geometric precision, every fold of cloth arranged to suggest marble sculpture, the colors cool and controlled, nothing left to chance or spontaneity. And his students absorbed these lessons, carried them forward into the new century, believing as he did that art should elevate and instruct, should stand apart from the messiness of everyday life. But even then, even in those opening years when neoclassicism seemed unassailable, other possibilities were stirring, other ways of seeing beginning to emerge in studios across Europe. In Spain, Francisco Goya worked in a register entirely his own, court painter to kings and witness to war. His early works displayed the technical brilliance expected of a royal portraitist, but something darker moved beneath those surfaces, something that would eventually burst forth in images of violence and nightmare, visions that seemed to come from some place the academies never acknowledged. Goya's portraits from the 1790s capture Spanish aristocracy with unflinching honesty. He painted the royal family in 1800, and while the composition follows traditional formulas, there is something unsettling in how he renders their faces, a psychological penetration that borders on cruel, as if he sees past the costumes and jewels to something more troubling underneath. And when war came to Spain, when Napoleon's forces invaded and the country descended into brutal conflict, Goya responded with images that shattered every convention about how violence should be depicted. His disasters of war etchings show bodies broken and piled, faces contorted in agony, scenes rendered with stark economy, no classical nobility, no redemptive meaning, just the terrible weight of what humans do to each other. This was painting moving toward something new, toward a willingness to confront subjects the academies preferred to ignore, toward an art that could contain darkness as well as light, chaos as well as order. In England, Joseph Mallord William Turner was beginning his own revolution, though it would unfold more gradually. His early works displayed the topographical precision expected of landscape painting in that era, ruins and abbeys rendered with architectural accuracy, compositions balanced according to established principles, everything the Royal Academy recognized as proper and accomplished. But Turner was obsessed with light, with atmosphere, with the way weather could transform a scene from moment to moment. And as the years progressed, as he gained hushed confidence and reputation, his paintings began to dissolve, solid forms giving way to veils of color and mist. The world reimagined as pure luminosity. By 1812, by 1815, Turner's canvases were becoming increasingly radical. His Hannibal crossing the Alps depicts the ancient general's army almost consumed by a vortex of storm, the historical subject merely an excuse to explore the overwhelming power of natural forces, tiny figures dwarfed by swirling darkness and bursts of light. Critics didn't always know what to make of these works. Some praised their ambition, while others complained they looked unfinished, sketchy, as if Turner had stopped before the painting was complete. But he was after something they couldn't quite grasp, not the imitation of nature, but the sensation of it, the feeling of standing before vastness, of being surrounded by weather and light in constant transformation. Across the Channel, in Germany, Caspar David Friedrich painted landscapes of an entirely different character, where Turner pursued movement and dissolution. Friedrich created images of profound stillness, lone figures standing before mountains or ruined abbeys or endless seas, their backs turned to the viewer, gazing into distances we can only imagine. These paintings from the 1810s and 1820s operate as spiritual meditations. The natural world becomes a space for contemplation, for measuring human smallness against the infinite. Friedrich's Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog shows a man on a rocky peak, looking out over layers of mist-shrouded mountains. We see what he sees, but can never fully know his thoughts. His inner experience remains private, mysterious. There is something deeply romantic in this, in the way Friedrich's landscapes make room for solitude and introspection, for the sublime emotions that wild nature can provoke, terror and awe, and a kind of religious reverence that needs no church, just mountains and sky and the overwhelming sense of something greater than ourselves. In France, Theodore Géricault was pushing history painting toward contemporary tragedy. His massive canvas, The Raft of the Medusa, depicted a recent shipwreck, survivors stranded on a makeshift raft, bodies piled in various states of life and death, the composition pyramidal like classical art, but the subject matter visceral and immediate and deeply disturbing. Géricault researched this painting with obsessive thoroughness. He interviewed survivors, visited morgues to study dead bodies, built a scale model of the raft. He wanted accuracy not for its own sake, but to make the horror feel real, to create a history painting about the present moment, about actual suffering rather than mythological allegory. The painting caused a sensation when exhibited in 1819. Some viewers found it too graphic, too political in its implicit critique of French naval incompetence. But Géricault had demonstrated that large-scale painting could address contemporary events, could find grandeur and meaning in recent tragedy rather than ancient myth. Eugène Delacroix absorbed these lessons and carried them further. His The Massacre at Chios depicted Greeks suffering under Ottoman violence. His Liberty Leading the People transformed the July Revolution of 1830 into an allegorical vision, a bare-breasted liberty striding over barricades, tricolor flag raised high, bodies of the fallen scattered beneath her feet. These were romantic paintings in the fullest sense, privileging emotion over reason, color over line, movement over stasis. Delacroix's brushwork was loose and energetic, his compositions dynamic rather than static, everything designed to provoke feeling, to sweep the viewer into the drama unfolding on canvas. The academies resisted this new direction. They still taught that drawing was superior to color, that composition should be carefully planned rather than improvised, that noble subjects demanded noble treatment, restrained and dignified. But the Romantic painters were after something else. They wanted passion, intensity. They wanted art that could match the tumultuous character of their age. In England, John Constable was revolutionizing landscape, painting through obsessive attention to specific places, to the fields and streams and skies of his native Suffolk. He painted the same locations again and again, studying how light changed across seasons, how clouds built and dispersed, how water reflected the sky's moods. Constable's technique involved building up surfaces with thick applications of paint, sometimes using a palette knife to create texture. His skies were full of movement, masses of white and gray clouds suggesting weight and moisture. He wanted his landscapes to feel alive, to capture the freshness of direct observation rather than the stale formulas of studio composition. When his paintings were exhibited in Paris in the 1820s, they influenced a generation of French painters. That directness of approach, that willingness to make nature itself the subject without mythological pretense, it suggested possibilities that would flower in the decades to come. And in those same years, in rural France, in the village of Barbizon near the forest of Fontainebleau, painters were beginning to gather, drawn by the ancient woods and agricultural landscapes, seeking to paint nature directly, without classical embellishment, without the idealizing conventions the academies promoted. Théodore Rousseau, Jean-François Millet, Charles-François d'Aubigny, these artists of the Barbizon school worked outdoors, making studies from life, then completing larger canvases in their studios. They painted peasants working the land, forest interiors dappled with light, twilight scenes of cattle returning home, ordinary subjects treated with deep seriousness. Millet's The Gleaners shows three women bent over a harvested field, gathering leftover grain, their bodies forming a rhythmic pattern of labor. The horizon line high so we see them against vast expanses of wheat stubble. It is a painting about work, about poverty, about the dignity of rural life, presented without sentimentality or condescension. This was painting moving steadily toward realism, toward a conviction that contemporary life, even in its most humble manifestations, deserved the attention once reserved for gods and saints. The shift was gradual but inexorable, the century turning away from classical idealism, turning toward the world as it actually appeared, in all its beauty and harshness, its poetry and its plainness. The 1850s arrive, and with them a new assertiveness about what painting could be, about what deserved to be seen and celebrated on canvas. Gustave Courbet declared himself a realist, and meant it as a challenge, a rejection of everything the Salon and the Academy held sacred. No more gods, no more allegories, only the visible world rendered with unflinching honesty. Courbet's The Stone Breakers depicted two laborers, an old man and a young boy, breaking rocks by the roadside, their faces turned away, their bodies bent to thankless work. He painted them life-size, the scale traditionally reserved for historical or religious subjects, and in doing so he made a radical argument that these anonymous workers were as worthy of monumental treatment as any emperor or saint. The painting scandalized many viewers, not because of its technique, which was robust and confident, but because of its subject matter, because Courbet refused to beautify poverty or make labor picturesque. He showed it as it was, brutal and grinding and ordinary, the kind of scene people passed on country roads without a second thought, now impossible to ignore. His studio in Ornans became a kind of a headquarters for this new realism. He painted himself there in the painter's studio, a massive canvas showing the artist at his easel, surrounded by various figures, models, and patrons and friends. The painting subtitled A Real Allegory, that paradoxical phrase capturing something essential about what he was attempting, to make the real world allegorical simply by attending to it with sufficient seriousness. In Paris, in these same years, Edouard Manet was beginning his own campaign against academic conventions, though his methods were more subtle, more rooted in the language of the old masters, even as he transformed it into something shockingly new. Manet studied the Spanish painters at the Louvre, Velázquez especially, absorbing their bold contrasts of light and dark, their flattened pictorial corporeal space, their refusal of unnecessary detail, and he brought these lessons to contemporary Parisian subjects. Café scenes and parks and boulevards, the modern city as it actually looked in the 1860s. Olympia caused an uproar at the Salon of 1865. The painting depicted a nude woman, a prostitute, clearly, reclining on white sheets, meeting the viewer's gaze with cool directness, a black servant bringing flowers, presumably from a client. Everything rendered with shocking plainness, no mythological alibi, no softening of the transaction being implied. The pose referenced Titian's Venus of Urbino, that Renaissance masterpiece of idealized beauty, but where Titian's Venus embodied timeless femininity. Manet's Olympia was entirely of her moment, a working woman in modern Paris, her body pale against dark surroundings, painted with broad, flat areas of color, rather than the subtle modeling academic technique demanded. Critics attacked the painting viciously. They called it vulgar, ugly, unfinished. They objected to the way Manet had painted her skin without conventional shading, without the smooth transitions that made flesh look soft and inviting. But Manet was after a different kind of truth, not idealization but observation, not fantasy but fact. His luncheon on the grass had provoked similar outrage 2 years earlier, showing a nude woman sitting casually with 2 fully dressed men in a park, another woman bathing in the background, the spatial relationships deliberately flattened, the whole scene painted with that same bold simplification that made everything feel both immediate and strangely artificial. These paintings announced that modern life demanded modern techniques, that the old methods of smooth finish and illusionistic depth were inadequate for capturing the experience of contemporary Paris, the city of boulevards and department stores and public parks, of gaslight and railway stations and crowds moving through spaces designed for spectacle and commerce. And it was, in these years, the 1860s, sliding into the 1870s, that a group of younger painters began gathering, meeting at cafes, discussing these questions of how to paint the modern world, how to capture not just its appearance but its tempo, its light, its fundamental character as something new in human history. Claude Monet, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Alfred Sisley, Camille Pissarro, they painted together at La Grenouillère, a popular bathing spot on the Seine, setting up their easels side by side, attempting to capture the shimmer of sunlight on water, the movement of figures in summer leisure, the whole scene broken into patches of color, quick brushstrokes that suggested rather than described. This was painting moving outdoors in earnest, not just for studies but for finished works. The development of paint in tubes had made this newly possible. Artists could carry their materials into fields and forests, could work directly before the motif instead of relying on memory and studio convention. Monet became obsessed with this approach, with painting the same subject under different conditions of light and weather, haystacks and poplar trees, and the facade of Rouen Cathedral, returning again and again to observe how morning light differed from afternoon, how fog transformed familiar forms into veils of gray and lavender, how winter snow created entirely different relationships of color and tone. His technique grew increasingly broken, individual brushstrokes visible, patches of pure color placed side by side rather than mixed on the palette. When seen up close, these paintings looked like abstract arrangements, but step back and they cohered into shimmering illusions of atmosphere and light, more convincing in their own way than any smooth academic finish. In 1874, the group organized their first independent exhibition, showing works the Salon had rejected or that they chose not to submit. Monet's Impression Sunrise gave the movement its name, though it was initially meant as an insult, a critic deriding these loose, sketchy works as mere impressions rather than finished paintings. But the artists embraced the term. It captured something essential about their project. They were after impressions, fleeting effects of light and color, the way a scene feels in a particular moment, rather than how it might be analyzed and reconstructed in a studio. They wanted to paint the experience of seeing, not just the things seen. Renoir brought a particular warmth to this approach. His paintings of Parisian leisure, balls and garden parties and cafe terraces, suffused with golden light, figures dappled with shadows from trees, everything suggesting pleasure and abundance, the new bourgeois Paris enjoying itself in public spaces. His luncheon of the boating party captures a group of friends gathered on a terrace overlooking the Seine, glasses of wine and plates of fruit scattered across a white tablecloth, figures in casual conversation, some leaning close, others gazing out at the river, the whole scene structured by alternating areas of light and shadow, warm oranges and cool blues creating spatial depth without linear perspective. Pissarro worked with similar techniques, but toward different ends. His street scenes of Paris, his views of Rouen and other provincial cities possess a more democratic character. He painted workers and markets, rainy days and ordinary traffic, finding beauty in the everyday commerce of urban life, in the rhythms of work and weather. And he painted the countryside around Pontoise with deep affection, orchards and kitchen gardens, peasants tending crops, village streets in different seasons, his brushwork building up surfaces with small touches of varied color, greens inflected with blue and yellow and violet, creating a sense of light filtering through leaves, of air moving across cultivated land. Edgar Degas stood somewhat apart from the others. He rarely painted outdoors, preferring to work in his studio from memory and quick sketches, but he shared their interest in modern subjects, in capturing contemporary Paris through fresh eyes, ballet dancers and laundresses, cafe singers and women bathing, moments of private absorption rendered with penetrating observation. Degas studied movement obsessively, dancers stretching at the bar, horses racing at Longchamp, laundresses pressing heavy irons across fabric. He understood bodies in space, how weight shifted, how gestures revealed character and mood, and he composed his paintings with daring asymmetry, figures cut off by the frame, viewpoints suggesting the casual glance rather than formal arrangement. His pastels, especially, those images of dancers in rehearsal, show his mastery of color and form, layers of vibrant chalk creating effects of extraordinary delicacy, tutus catching light, flesh tones modulated with green and blue shadows, everything suggesting the specific quality of gaslight in theaters, artificial illumination creating its own particular atmosphere. Berthe Morisot brought an intimate domesticity to Impressionism. Paintings of her daughter, of gardens and terraces, of women in interior spaces, her brushwork loose and confident, white dresses rendered with swift strokes of cream and gray and palest blue, capturing the play of light on fabric, on skin, on the surfaces of bourgeois comfort. She exhibited in almost all the Impressionist shows, the only woman to do so with such consistency, and her works possess a distinctive tenderness, attention to private moments, mothers with children, women reading or sewing, the quiet spaces of domestic life elevated through careful observation and lyrical handling of paint. Mary Cassatt, an American working in Paris, developed a similar focus, though her compositions showed the influence of Japanese prints, flattened space, bold outlines, unexpected cropping. She painted mothers and children with unsentimental affection, everyday interactions elevated through formal sophistication, a woman bathing a child, reading a story, simple moments made monumental through scale and composition. The Impressionists faced years of mockery and financial struggle, their paintings dismissed as unfinished, as hasty sketches, mistaken for art, but they persisted, organizing exhibition after exhibition, slowly building an audience that could see what they were attempting, could appreciate the freshness of their vision, the way they had captured something essential about modern experience. By the 1880s, Impressionism had begun to fracture, to evolve in different directions as individual painters pursued their own questions, their own dissatisfactions with what the movement had achieved, the unity of those first exhibitions giving way to more personal investigations. Georges Seurat took the Impressionist interest in color and light and subjected it to scientific analysis. He read treatises on optics, studied theories of color perception, and developed a technique he called divisionism, later known as pointillism, building entire paintings from tiny dots of pure color, each one distinct when viewed up close, merging into coherent forms when seen from proper distance. His A Sunday Afternoon on the Island of La Grande Jatte took 2 years to complete. Every inch of the enormous canvas covered with small touches of paint, figures frozen in leisurely poses, umbrellas and boats and dogs, the whole scene possessing a monumental stillness despite its contemporary subject, as if Seurat had transformed a casual moment into something timeless through sheer methodical application. The painting divided critics. Some admired its systematic approach, its marriage of art and science. Others found it cold, mechanical, lacking the spontaneity that made Impressionism feel alive. But Seurat had demonstrated that the sketch-like techniques of his predecessors could be refined into something more deliberate, more controlled, without sacrificing luminosity. Paul Cézanne, meanwhile, was pursuing an entirely different revolution, working in isolation in Provence, painting Mont Sainte-Victoire again and again, studying how form emerges from color, how space can be constructed through careful modulation of warm and cool tones rather than traditional perspective. Cézanne's canvases from the 1880s and 90s look simple at first: apples on a table, a few pine trees, a mountain seen from his studio, but the longer you observe them, the stranger they become. Tables tilted at impossible angles, multiple viewpoints combined in a single image, forms built from patches of color that seem to shift between flatness and depth. He was after something fundamental, trying to understand the basic structure of perception, how we translate the chaos of visual experience into coherent form. His brushstrokes became architectural, small parallel marks building up surfaces, creating rhythm and solidity. Each painting a kind of meditation on the nature of seeing itself. Fellow painters began to recognize his importance. Younger artists made pilgrimages to Aix-en-Provence to meet him, to understand his methods. He told them to treat nature through the cylinder and the sphere and the cone, to find the geometric foundations underlying organic forms, advice that would echo through the next century. In Paris, in Montmartre, Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec painted the city's nightlife with sardonic affection, cabarets and brothels, dancers and prostitutes, the demi-monde rendered with fluid lines and acid colors, his posters for the Moulin Rouge transforming commercial art into something genuinely innovative, bold silhouettes, flat areas of color, Japanese influence filtered through absinthe and gaslight. Lautrec's paintings possess a psychological acuity that can feel almost cruel. He saw through pretense, captured moments of weariness and calculation beneath the performance, a dancer adjusting her costume, a woman waiting for clients, everything rendered with economy and insight, his own physical limitations, his stunted growth from childhood accidents, perhaps sharpening his observation of those who sold their bodies for entertainment. Vincent van Gogh arrived in Paris in 1886, his palette still dark from his Dutch period, paintings of peasants rendered in muddy browns and grays. But exposure to Impressionism transformed his approach. Color became brighter, more intense, his brushwork more energetic, swirling and pulsing with an urgency that reflected his turbulent inner life. He moved to Arles in 1888, seeking the intense light of southern France, and there his vision fully flowered, sunflowers blazing yellow against turquoise, wheat fields rippling under violent skies, cypresses twisting like dark flames, everything painted with passionate immediacy, thick applications of paint, creating surfaces that seem almost sculpted. Van Gogh's letters to his brother Theo reveal his thinking, his belief that color could express emotion directly, that complementary colors vibrating against each other could create effects more powerful than realistic representation. He wanted his paintings to console, to communicate feeling, to offer something of value to a world that had little use for him while he lived. The bedroom at Arles, the starry night, the flowering trees, these paintings from his final years possess an intensity that still feels overwhelming, as if the world has become purely expressive, every element charged with meaning and emotion, the distinction between inner and outer dissolved in swirling color and urgent mark-making. Paul Gauguin sought escape from European civilization entirely, first to Brittany, where he painted Breton peasants as if they were medieval figures, flattened forms outlined in dark, symbolic rather than naturalistic, then to Tahiti, where he imagined he might find an unspoiled primitive paradise. His Tahitian paintings from the 1890s present an idealized vision of island life, women in sarongs lounging in tropical landscapes, colors intensified beyond nature, pinks and oranges and deep purples, everything arranged decoratively, less interested in optical truth than in creating images that felt mysterious, spiritual, connected to something primal and elemental. Gauguin rejected Impressionism's focus on fleeting effects. He wanted painting to address eternal questions, to tap into myths and symbols. His canvases combined Christian imagery with Polynesian motifs, creating a personal mythology that was part fantasy, part genuine engagement with Tahitian culture, though always filtered through European romantic projection. In England, the American expatriate James McNeill Whistler was developing his own aesthetic, paintings titled as Nocturnes and Symphonies, emphasizing their kinship with music, their existence as arrangements of color and tone rather than representations of specific places. His nocturne in black and gold showed fireworks over the Thames, the painting almost abstract, touches of gold against dark, the subject barely discernible. When the critic John Ruskin accused him of flinging a pot of paint in the public's face, Whistler sued for libel. The trial became a debate about the nature of art itself, whether a painting's value resided in the hours spent making it or in the artistic vision it embodied. Whistler won, but was awarded only a farthing in damages. The legal costs bankrupted him. Yet he had made his point that painting need not be about faithful representation, that it could aspire to the condition of music, pure arrangement, form and color existing for their own sake. John Singer Sargent-dominated portrait painting in these decades, his technique dazzling. He could capture a face with a few swift strokes, render silk and satin with breathtaking virtuosity. His society portraits showed the wealthy and powerful in all their assured elegance, though occasionally, as in Madame at Guy, his psychological penetration created scandal. But Sargent also painted watercolors of extraordinary freshness, architectural studies in Venice, figures resting in gardens. These looser works revealing his pure pleasure in paint, in capturing effects of light and shadow without the constraints of formal portraiture. Quick notations of seeing that feel utterly contemporary even now. The century drew toward its close, and painting had transformed beyond recognition. The academic certainties of 1800 dissolved, replaced by multiple competing visions, multiple ways of understanding what a painting could be and do. Symbolist painters like Gustave Moreau created canvases dense with mythological imagery, jeweled surfaces, dreamlike narratives, while Nabis artists like Pierre Bonnard and Edouard Vuillard painted intimate domestic scenes, wall-papered rooms, women sewing, everyday life transfigured through pattern and color. In Scandinavia, Edvard Munch was painting anxiety and desire, his The Scream capturing existential dread in swirling lines and acid colors. A figure on a bridge, hands to face, mouth open in silent anguish, the landscape behind warping into undulating bands of orange and blue, as if the world itself vibrates with unbearable feeling. Each painter now seemed to be inventing their own language, their own way of translating experience into paint, the unified styles of earlier academies replaced by radical individualism, by the conviction that art should express personal vision rather than conform to collective standards. The 19th century had begun with painters looking backward, drawing inspiration from classical antiquity, seeking to perpetuate traditions centuries old, but it ended with artists facing forward, embracing the new, the subjective, the experimental, willing to sacrifice beauty for truth, harmony for expression, acceptance for authenticity. And in their studios, in Paris and London and Munich and beyond, painters were already beginning the experiments that would define the coming century, already pushing toward abstraction, toward cubism and fauvism and expressionism, procured the seeds of modernism planted in these final years, germinating in the minds of those who had learned from Cézanne and Van Gogh and Gauguin that painting need not mirror the world, that it could remake it, reimagine it, reveal dimensions of experience that had no other means of expression. The light in those studios, that patient northern light, continued to fall across canvases, across palettes loaded with color, across hands holding brushes, and the work continued as it always had, as it always would, one stroke following another, building worlds from pigment and vision, from observation and imagination, from the inexhaustible human need to see and to show and to understand through the slow, patient accumulation of marks on surface. The question of what these painters were actually doing, what they believed they were accomplishing in those hours of patient application, deserves deeper consideration, because they were not simply recording what they saw. They were constructing entire philosophies of vision, entire theories of how the visible world relates to human consciousness and experience. Consider the simple act of choosing a subject, Monet, standing before a haystack, deciding that this ordinary agricultural form contains within it something worth sustained attention. worth returning to again and again across seasons. That decision itself represents a radical revaluation of what matters, what deserves to be seen and celebrated and preserved. The haystack becomes a kind of collaborator in the investigation, its surface catching light differently at dawn than at noon than at dusk, its cylindrical form creating shadows that shift as the sun arcs across the sky. Monet was not painting haystacks. He was painting time itself, the way moments accumulate into days, the way looking closely at anything reveals infinite variation. And this sustained attention requires a kind of love, or at least a deep curiosity about the nature of appearance, because the eye must be convinced to see past habit, past the mental shortcuts that allow us to navigate the world efficiently, but blind us to its actual character, its moment-by-moment transformation. The Impressionists trained themselves to see like children, or like people who had just gained sight after a lifetime of blindness, to notice the violet shadows on snow, the orange reflections in water at sunset, the way flesh is never simply pink, but contains greens and blues and yellows, all the colors the mind edits out in the interest of recognizing skin as a category rather than experiencing it as a phenomenon. This required unlearning as much as learning, setting aside the formulas taught in academies, the received wisdom about how trees should be painted or water or sky, trusting instead the direct report of the senses, however strange or counterintuitive that report might seem. Cézanne took this project even further, deeper into the structure of perception itself. He understood that we do not see the world from a single fixed point. Our eyes move constantly, our head shifts, our body sways slightly, and our mind assembles these multiple glimpses into a coherent image that actually represents a synthesis, a construction, not a pure recording. So his paintings incorporate this movement, show objects from slightly different angles simultaneously, create space through color relationships rather than linear perspective, the mountain seen from here and also from there, the table both flat and tilted, everything true to the actual process of seeing, even as it violates the conventions of pictorial representation. This is painting as a form of epistemology, a way of investigating how we know what we know, how visual information becomes understanding, how patches of color and degrees of lightness resolve into the experience of a three-dimensional world populated with objects in space and atmosphere. And there is something profound in the way these painters devoted their lives to questions that could never be fully answered, because light is infinite in its variations, because no two moments are ever precisely the same, because the world continuously offers more than any painting can contain, and yet the attempt must be made, the effort itself constituting a kind of meaning. Van Gogh understood this. His letters speak of wanting to paint infinity, to suggest through color and movement something that transcends the physical scene. A cypress tree becomes a dark flame reaching toward heaven. A wheat field becomes a symbol of life's abundance and fragility, everything charged with significance beyond its literal identity. His paintings feel urgent because he knew his time was limited, felt the pressure of everything he wanted to express, needed to communicate, and so the paint goes on thickly, swirling, pulsing, as if the canvas cannot contain the energy he pours into it, as if the world itself vibrates with more meaning than any single work can hold. This urgency stands in contrast to Cézanne's patient deliberation, his willingness to work on a single painting for months or years, adding small touches, reconsidering relationships, seeking a balance that satisfied his exacting sense of structure. Both approaches equally valid, equally necessary, different temperaments, finding different paths to similar goals. And perhaps this is the deepest lesson of 19th century painting, that there is no single correct way to see, no single truth about appearance, only individual visions, each partial, each revealing something the others miss. Monet's shimmer and Cézanne's solidity, and Van Gogh's expressiveness and Degas' psychological acuity, all needed, all contributing to a larger understanding of what painting can be and do. The studios where this work happened were not romantic garrets. Well, some were, but many were professional spaces, organized for the practical business of making art. Tables for mixing paint, north-facing windows for consistent light, storage for canvases and stretchers and frames, the physical infrastructure required for sustained creative production. And the painters themselves were not isolated geniuses. They were part of communities, arguing in cafes, writing letters, visiting each other's studios, learning from and influencing one another. Art emerging from conversation and collaboration as much as from solitary inspiration. This social dimension matters because painting in the 19th century was also about building alternative structures, creating exhibition spaces outside official channels, developing markets that did not depend on academic approval, establishing the possibility of artistic independence, of making work according to personal conviction rather than institutional expectation. The Impressionist exhibitions, the Salon des Refusés, the independent galleries, these were not just venues for showing art. They were assertions of autonomy, declarations that painters could determine for themselves what mattered, could address audiences directly without institutional mediation, and slowly, gradually, over decades, this independence became normalized. The idea that artists should be free to pursue their vision, however unconventional, however challenging to established taste. This became part of the culture's understanding of what art is and how it functions. The 19th century gave us this gift, this expansion of possibility, this multiplication of approaches, so that by 1900 painting contained multitudes, realism and symbolism and impressionism and post-impressionism and countless individual variations, each valid, each offering its own particular insight. And now, at this late hour, with the century closed and its painters long since gone, their canvases remain, hanging in museums and private collections, still capable of stopping us in our tracks, still able to make us see differently. I think of standing before a Monet, how the surface dissolves up close into pure abstraction, just color and texture, and then stepping back, watching it cohere into water lilies floating on a pond, light filtering through willow branches, the miracle of representation emerging from chaos, from the accumulation of individual marks, each one a small decision, a commitment to a particular hue, a specific placement, or a Cézanne still life, apples on a table. Such a simple subject, and yet the longer you look, the more complex it becomes, the way the table seems to tilt, the way space compresses and expands, the way color creates form. You could spend hours with a single painting and not exhaust its possibilities, not fully grasp all the relationships Cézanne has orchestrated. This is what these painters left us, not just beautiful objects, though many are beautiful, but new ways of attending to the world, new possibilities for awareness. They trained themselves to see, and in doing so, trained us, expanded our capacity for noticing, for appreciating, for finding meaning in light and color and form. The studios are empty now, the palettes cleaned, the brushes laid down, but the work persists, continues to teach, continues to offer its particular kind of knowledge, the knowledge that comes through looking, through patient, sustained attention to appearance, through the willingness to be surprised by what is right in front of us. I imagine those painters, Monet in his garden at Giverny, Cézanne on the hillside above Aix, Berthe Morisot in her Paris apartment, all of them engaged in the same essential activity, trying to translate the visible world into something that could be shared, could be preserved, could speak to people they would never meet in times they could not imagine. And here we are, more than a century later, still receiving that communication, still standing before their canvases, still learning to see through their eyes, still grateful for their dedication, their persistence, their refusal to accept that the old ways were the only ways. That tradition should constrain vision. The light continues to fall, even now, across fields and cities, across water and mountains, across all the surfaces of the world, and somewhere people are still painting, still trying to capture something of that light, still engaged in the ancient patient work of making images, continuing conversations these 19th century masters began. Their voices fade now into the general silence, into the accumulated history of art, but they are not lost. They persist in every painting made with attention, in every attempt to see clearly, to honor what appears, to find in the visible world something worth preserving. The canvases wait in their museums, in their quiet galleries, patient as the painters who made them, ready to speak to anyone willing to look, to stand still long enough to receive what they offer. These windows into other ways of seeing, these invitations to notice, to appreciate, to understand through the eloquent, silent language of paint on surface. And perhaps that is enough, perhaps that is everything, to have seen clearly, to have recorded faithfully, to have found in ordinary subjects, in light and shadow and color, something extraordinary, something that justifies the hours, the years, the lifetimes spent in studios, before easels, seeking always that next stroke, that next color, that next small step toward capturing what cannot quite be captured, but must nonetheless be attempted. The attempt itself, the sustained effort, the daily return to the work, this is the real subject, the deepest meaning, not the finished paintings, beautiful as they are, but the process, the practice, the commitment to seeing, to making, to offering what vision discovers to a world that might not immediately understand, but might someday, in time, come to value what these patient, dedicated souls created. And so the story ends where it began, with light falling across canvas, with painters long gone, but their work remaining, with the quiet knowledge that some things persist, some efforts bear fruit across generations, some seeing changes how we all see forever. The studios are dark now, the windows closed, but the paintings glow still, in galleries, in books, in memory, continuing their patient work of teaching us to see, to notice, to attend to the inexhaustible beauty of the visible world. I imagine a place where silence lives, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of deep attention, the kind that gathers when countless minds have passed through the same threshold, seeking something they cannot always name. There is a particular quality to the air in certain rooms, a stillness that feels almost intentional, as though the space itself has learned to hold its breath. And in that holding, in that patient suspension, something extraordinary occurs. Knowledge becomes tangible. Ideas take on weight and texture, and time moves differently than it does in the world outside. I think of buildings constructed for a singular purpose, structures designed not for commerce or industry or spectacle, but for the patient accumulation of human understanding, places where the architecture itself whispers of continuity, where stone and wood and careful craftsmanship create chambers meant to outlast the lives of those who built them, meant to serve generations not yet born. The concept is ancient, older than empires, older than the written systems that would eventually fill these spaces. The simple recognition that what we learn, what we discover, what we create with our minds deserves to be gathered, protected, offered to those who come after. Before there were buildings, there were keepers, individuals entrusted with the responsibility of remembering, of preserving the stories and formulas and observations that form the foundation of understanding. These were living libraries, human vessels of accumulated wisdom, and the communities that relied upon them understood implicitly the fragility of knowledge passed only through voice and memory. But something shifts when knowledge finds a more permanent home, when it moves from the ephemeral territory of human recall into physical form. Clay tablets pressed with wedge-shaped marks, papyrus scrolls wrapped carefully against the deterioration of time, parchment pages bound between protective covers. Suddenly, the scope of what can be preserved expands exponentially. And with that expansion comes the need for spaces designed specifically to house these growing collections. I picture the earliest of these places, rooms in palaces and temples where scrolls were stored in neat rows, where scholars could consult records of harvests and astronomical observations, tax collections and royal decrees. These were not public spaces, not open to wandering curiosity, but restricted archives serving the administrative and religious functions of early civilizations. Yet even in their exclusivity, they represented something remarkable, the understanding that written knowledge required dedicated space, plus careful organization, intentional preservation. The Mesopotamians kept such collections, meticulously cataloged tablets recording everything from mathematical calculations to epic poetry. The Egyptians maintained houses of papyrus, extensive holdings of religious texts and practical manuals. And in doing so, they established patterns that would echo through millennia. The recognition that knowledge scattered and disorganized becomes knowledge lost. That collection requires curation, that preservation demands more than simply accumulating material. It requires systems, attention, devotion to the task of making information accessible. And there is something profoundly human in this impulse, this drive to gather what we have learned and make it available to others, to create institutional memory that transcends individual lifetimes. It speaks to an optimism about the future, a belief that there will be people who want to know, who need to know, who will benefit from access to the accumulated understanding of those who came before. I think about the first person to organize a collection, to decide that scrolls should be arranged by subject or author, to create some system by which a specific text could be located among hundreds or thousands, the care required for such work, the recognition that a collection without order becomes a labyrinth, beautiful perhaps in its abundance, but frustrating in its impenetrability. The ancient world saw these institutions grow in ambition and scale, moving beyond purely administrative functions towards something more expansive, the recognition that knowledge itself, divorced from immediate practical application, held value, that poetry and philosophy and history deserve preservation alongside accounting records and legal codes, that human culture produced wisdom worth maintaining even when it served no obvious utilitarian purpose, and so the buildings grew larger, the collections more diverse, the missions more encompassing. Rooms became wings, wings became entire complexes, and the people who tended these spaces, who cataloged and preserved and made accessible the gathered materials, became a distinct profession, guardians of something both precious and peculiar, repositories of human thought made manifest in physical form. The ancient Mediterranean world understood something profound about the relationship between power and knowledge, that empires built on military might alone would crumble, but empires that cultivated learning, that gathered the intellectual wealth of conquered peoples and made it their own, these could achieve a different kind of permanence, a legacy that outlasted stone monuments and territorial boundaries. In the 3rd century before the Common Era, in a city named for its conqueror, at the delta where the Nile meets the sea, the Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt conceived of something unprecedented in scale and ambition, an institution that would attempt to gather all the knowledge of the known world under a single roof, to create a collection so comprehensive that scholars would need to travel nowhere else. Everything worth knowing would be there, waiting. Alexandria was already a marvel, a planned city of wide streets and impressive architecture, a meeting place of cultures where Greek and Egyptian and Jewish communities mingled, where trade routes converged and ideas cross-pollinated, and into this cosmopolitan environment came the vision of the Musion, the temple of the Muses, and its extraordinary library. The ambition was breathtaking. Messengers were sent to every corner of the known world with instructions to purchase or copy any texts they encountered. Ships arriving at Alexandria's harbor were searched, not for contraband in the traditional sense, but for books. Any scrolls found would be confiscated, taken to the library where they would be meticulously copied. The copies returned to the ship owners, while the originals remained in the collection, a practice that spoke both to the value placed on authentic texts and to the ruthless determination to acquire knowledge by any means necessary. The numbers are staggering even by modern standards. Estimates suggest the library may have held between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls at its height. Though precise accounting is impossible now, lost to the same forces that would eventually claim the library itself. But imagine the physical reality of such a collection. Hall after hall, lined with wooden shelves or cylindrical containers, each holding rolled papyrus marked with titles and authors, a labyrinth of human thought and observation, poetry and mathematics, astronomy and medicine, history and philosophy, drama and engineering. The scholars who worked there were not mere custodians. They were supported by royal patronage, given stipends and housing, freed from financial concerns so they might dedicate themselves entirely to study, to translation, to the advancement of understanding. It was perhaps the first true research institution, a place where inquiry itself was the primary occupation, where the production of new knowledge was valued as highly as the preservation of old. And they produced remarkable work in those halls. Euclid may have developed his geometric principles there, organizing mathematical knowledge into a systematic framework that would dominate the field for 2 millennia. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth with astonishing accuracy, using geometry and observations of shadows at different latitudes. Aristarchus proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system 17 centuries before Copernicus would receive credit for the same insight. The library was not merely a repository, it was an engine of discovery. The organization of such a vast collection required innovation. The head librarians, figures like Zenodotus and Callimachus, developed systematic cataloging methods. Callimachus created the Pinaches. Effectively, the first library catalog, a 120-volume index organizing works by subject and author, providing plot summaries and biographical information, establishing standards for citation and attribution that echo through the modern scholarship. It was an extraordinary intellectual achievement in its own right. The recognition that access requires order, that a collection ungoverned by systematic organization becomes unusable regardless of its richness. But Alexandria was not alone in recognizing the value of gathered knowledge across the Mediterranean. In Pergamon, another Hellenistic kingdom was building its own great library, creating a rivalry that drove both institutions to greater heights of acquisition and scholarship. When the Ptolemies attempted to restrict the export of papyrus to handicap their competitors, Pergamon responded by developing parchment, treated animal skin that proved more durable than papyrus, a technological innovation driven by the competition for intellectual supremacy. In Rome, as the Republic gave way to empire, wealthy citizens began assembling private libraries, recognizing that a collection of Greek and Latin texts signaled cultural sophistication, intellectual seriousness, participation in the broader world of learning, and eventually, Rome would establish public libraries, institutions funded by the state and open to citizens, the first in the Western world to embrace the concept that access to knowledge should extend beyond the wealthy elite. The idea traveled, evolved, adapted to different cultures and needs. In ancient China, imperial libraries preserved classical texts and historical records, employing scholar officials to maintain and interpret the collections. Confucian emphasis on learning and the examination system created deep respect for books and the institutions that housed them. Though natural disasters and political upheavals would repeatedly destroy these collections, the commitment to rebuilding them remained constant. The recognition that continuity of culture depended upon continuity of access to foundational texts. The Great Library at Alexandria met an end that remains contested and unclear. Not a single catastrophic event, but likely a gradual decline. Fires during Julius Caesar's siege, budget cuts under later Roman rule, the rise of Christianity and deliberate destruction of pagan texts eventually grew. The physical structure may have been damaged or destroyed during the Muslim conquest, though by then the collection itself had long since dispersed or deteriorated. What remains clear is the loss, the absence, the countless works that existed in single copies, plays by Sophocles and Euripides that we know existed only through references in surviving texts, scientific treatises, historical accounts, poetry, philosophy, gone. But the idea survived, the concept that knowledge could and should be gathered or organized, preserved, made accessible. It would resurface again and again throughout history, adapting to new technologies and social structures, but always maintaining that core recognition that human understanding advances through accumulation, through building upon the work of previous generations, through maintaining institutional memory that transcends individual mortality. In the Islamic world, as Europe entered its medieval period, a new golden age of learning emerged. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, established in the early 9th century, became a center of translation and scholarship where texts in Greek, Persian, Sanskrit were rendered into Arabic, where scholars from different religious and cultural backgrounds collaborated on projects of mathematical, astronomical, and medical research, where the works of Aristotle and Galen and Euclid found new life and commentary. The Abbasid caliphs who sponsored this institution understood something their European counterparts would not fully grasp for centuries, that investment in learning produced returns that military conquest alone could not, that a civilization's greatness could be measured by its intellectual achievements as much as by its territorial extent. And so they gathered scholars, provided resources, created an environment where inquiry flourished. The manuscripts produced in Baghdad and other centers of Islamic learning were themselves works of art. Calligraphy elevated to extraordinary levels of skill and beauty, illuminations and geometric decorations that transformed the page into visual poetry. The physical book became an object worthy of reverence, a vessel for knowledge, but also a demonstration of the civilization's aesthetic and technical achievements. These collections grew, spread across the Islamic world. In Cordoba, the Umayyad library reportedly held 400,000 volumes, a collection that rivaled ancient Alexandria. In Cairo, in Damascus, in countless other cities, institutions dedicated to learning gathered texts, supported scholars, created networks of intellectual exchange that spanned continents, and slowly, gradually, knowledge began flowing back into Europe. Through Spain, where Islamic and Christian scholars lived in proximity, through Sicily, through returning crusaders and traveling merchants, Latin translations of Arabic translations of Greek texts, sometimes with added Arabic commentary that enriched or challenged the original arguments. The West rediscovering its own classical heritage through the patient preservation work of scholars who had maintained and built upon that heritage, while Europe struggled through political fragmentation and economic decline. The medieval European monastery played a crucial role in this preservation. In scriptoria, monk scribes spent hours each day copying manuscripts by hand, religious texts primarily, but also classical works deemed valuable or compatible with Christian teaching. It was painstaking work. A single book might take months to complete. Every letter formed carefully, illuminations added with mineral pigments and gold leaf, and each completed volume represented not just text preserved, but labor offered as devotion, the work of copying understood as a form of prayer. Monastery libraries were often small by ancient standards, perhaps a few hundred volumes, but they represented continuity. Scattered repositories that collectively preserve fragments of classical learning through centuries when centralized institutions were rare, and the monastic tradition of study, of lectio divina and scholarly commentary, kept alive the practice of careful reading, close analysis, the recognition that texts rewarded sustained attention and contemplation. Cathedral schools and early universities began emerging in the 12th and 13th centuries, creating new demand for texts, new centers where books were needed, where students and masters required access to canonical works in theology, law, medicine, philosophy, and this demand stimulated the development of commercial book production, scriptoria, operating not as devotional practice, but as business, creating the infrastructure that would make possible an even more revolutionary transformation in how knowledge was preserved and disseminated. The invention that changed everything arrived not with fanfare, but with the practical concerns of a German goldsmith seeking a more efficient way to produce indulgences. Johannes Gutenberg's printing press, developed in the 1440s, transformed the relationship between knowledge and accessibility in ways that would ripple forward through centuries. What had required months of careful hand copying could now be reproduced in days with consistency, with accuracy, and in quantities previously unimaginable. The first substantial book printed with movable type was a Bible. The pages remarkably beautiful, designed to mimic the finest manuscript work so that early buyers might not even realize they were purchasing something mechanically produced. But the implications extended far beyond religious texts. Suddenly, the works of Aristotle, Galen, Ptolemy, could be produced in editions of hundreds, distributed across Europe, standardized in a way manuscripts never were, every copy of a printed book identical to every other, creating the possibility of shared reference, of scholars in distant cities working from exactly the same text. Within 50 years of Gutenberg's innovation, printing presses operated in more than 200 European cities, producing perhaps 20 million books. The speed of adoption speaks to the hunger that existed, the pent-up demand for access to texts that had been artificially scarce. And as books became more available, as prices dropped, the audience expanded, literacy rates began rising, and with them the potential readership for new ideas, controversial ideas, ideas that challenged established authority. The library as institution had to adapt to this new abundance. Collections that had been measured in hundreds now aspired to thousands, then tens of thousands. The challenge shifted from preservation of rare texts to selection, organization, management of ever-growing holdings. And new kinds of libraries emerged to serve different purposes, different constituencies. University libraries expanded dramatically. Oxford's Bodleian Library, established in the early 17th century, implemented a radical policy. It would attempt to collect everything published, at least everything published in England, through legal deposit requirements, Publishers were obligated to provide copies of new books, ensuring comprehensive collection of the nation's printed output. The ambition was extraordinary: to create a complete record of English intellectual and literary production, generation after generation, and the reading room itself became a space designed for contemplation and study. High ceilings, tall windows admitting natural light, long tables where scholars could spread out materials, request volumes from the stacks, spend hours or days immersed in research. Silence enforced not by stern librarians, but by mutual understanding among readers that this was a place for concentration, for the deep focus required by difficult texts, for the slow accumulation of understanding that comes only through sustained engagement. In France, the Bibliothèque Mazarine opened to scholars in the 1640s, followed by the Royal Library, which would eventually become the Bibliothèque Nationale. These were not merely repositories, but statements of national ambition, assertions that a great nation required great institutions of learning, that the collection and organization of knowledge reflected the sophistication of the state itself. Private libraries flourished among the wealthy, elaborate rooms lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes, purchased sometimes for their content, but often for their appearance. Books as markers of status and cultivation, yet even these collections, assembled partly for show, contributed to the broader ecosystem of preservation, and many would eventually be donated or bequeathed to institutions, becoming public resources. The 18th century brought the Enlightenment, and with it a new conception of the library's social role. Knowledge was increasingly understood not as the privileged domain of clergy and aristocracy, but as a public good, essential to the functioning of civil society, to the education of citizens, to the advancement of reason and progress. And so the movement toward public libraries gained momentum. Benjamin Franklin established a subscription library in Philadelphia in 1731. Members paid fees to support the collection and in return gained borrowing privileges. It was a modest beginning, but represented a crucial shift. The idea that ordinary citizens, tradesmen, and merchants should have access to books, that reading and self-education were not frivolous luxuries but essential components of civic participation and personal advancement. In Britain, the push for true public libraries, funded by taxation and free to all residents, gained strength through the 19th century. Advocates argued that providing working people with access to books would reduce social problems, encourage self-improvement, create a more informed and rational populace. The Public Libraries Act of 1850 allowed municipalities to levy taxes for library establishment, though adoption was gradual, meeting resistance from those who questioned whether public funds should support what they viewed as entertainment. But the libraries that emerged from this movement were remarkable spaces, often grand buildings designed to inspire respect for learning, entrance halls with vaulted ceilings, reading rooms with rows of wooden tables and brass lamps, children's sections bright and welcoming, reference departments staffed by librarians trained in the new science of library classification and service. These were democratic institutions in the truest sense, places where anyone could enter, request materials, spend the day reading, free from obligation to purchase or justify their presence. Andrew Carnegie's philanthropy accelerated this movement dramatically. Between 1883 and 1929, Carnegie funded the construction of more than 1,600 libraries, across the English-speaking world. The buildings followed certain principles. They should be impressive but not intimidating, clearly marked as public spaces, designed to welcome rather than exclude. And Carnegie insisted that communities demonstrate commitment by providing the land and promising to fund operations. His money would build the structure, but the community had to sustain the institution. The Carnegie libraries that rose in small towns and large cities shared design elements, often classical revival architecture, broad steps leading to columned entrances, high windows, separate reading rooms for adults and children, and they became community anchors, places where immigrants learned English, where children discovered books their parents could never afford to buy, where self-taught scholars pursued education, where the democratization of knowledge became tangible reality. Classification systems evolved to manage growing collections. Melville Dewey's decimal classification, developed in 1876, provided a framework for organizing all human knowledge into 10 main classes, subdivided decimally to allow infinite specificity. A book about the French Revolution would be found at 944.04, always, in every library using the system, creating standardization that made research across institutions possible. The order was logical, learnable, a tool that transformed libraries from mysterious repositories requiring expert guides into systems that users could navigate independently. The card catalog became the primary access point, wooden cabinets with hundreds of narrow drawers, each containing alphabetically arranged cards, author cards, title cards, subject cards, all referencing the same books from different angles. The physicality of the catalog was satisfying. The weight of the wooden drawer sliding open, the feel of flipping through cards, the small triumph of finding exactly what you sought, and the serendipity of discovering something unexpected while searching. Librarians themselves professionalized, developing training programs, ethical codes, standards of practice. The stereotype of the stern shushing librarian obscured the reality of skilled information professionals who understood classification systems, reference techniques, collection development, preservation methods, who could guide researchers to obscure materials, answer complex questions, connect people with the resources they needed. The good librarian was part detective, part teacher, part guardian of access. Special collections emerged within larger libraries, rare book rooms with climate control and security measures, manuscript departments preserving letters and papers of significant figures, archives maintaining institutional records and historical documents. These spaces operated under different rules. Materials often could not be borrowed, had to be used in supervised reading rooms, handled with cotton gloves, but they ensured preservation of the unique items while still allowing scholarly access. The great national libraries expanded continuously. The British Library, the Library of Congress, the Bibliothèque Nationale, collections reaching into the millions of volumes, employing hundreds of staff, occupying multiple buildings, developing specialized departments for maps, music, newspapers, photographs, every format and subject area, becoming research resources of incomparable depth, destinations for scholars from around the world, pursuing questions that required access to comprehensive holdings. The Library of Congress, Established in 1800 and initially destroyed when the British burned Washington during the War of 1812, was rebuilt through the purchase of Thomas Jefferson's personal library. 6,500 volumes reflecting his wide-ranging interests in history, science, philosophy, literature, law. This foundation established the library's ambition to collect comprehensively across all subjects, and as it grew, as copyright deposit laws directed copies of every American publication to its shelves, it became one of the world's great repositories, a research library serving Congress, but also the nation, eventually humanity. Reading rooms in these grand libraries were designed to inspire. The main reading room of the Library of Congress, completed in 1897, featured a dome rising 160 feet above the floor, elaborate decorations celebrating human achievement, statues of figures representing different fields of knowledge, long mahogany desks arranged in concentric circles, each with a reading lamp. The space itself argued for the nobility of scholarship, the importance of the work being done within those walls. Branch libraries extended the reach of these institutions into neighborhoods, small buildings, or even rooms in schools and community centers. Collections selected for local needs and interests, children's programming, literacy classes, meeting spaces for community groups. These were the democratic roots of the library system, the daily proof that access to knowledge was a right, not a privilege, that every community, regardless of wealth, deserved resources for learning and growth. The 20th century brought transformations that would have seemed like fantasy to earlier generations of librarians, technologies that changed not just how libraries operated, but what they fundamentally were, what they could offer, what role they played in the landscape of human knowledge. Microfilm emerged in the 1930s as a solution to preservation challenges, newspapers deteriorating on acidic paper, rare books too fragile for regular handling, bulky runs of periodicals consuming scarce shelf space. All could be photographed onto compact reels, stored in controlled environments, made accessible without risking the originals. Researchers learned to thread film onto readers, scroll through pages projected on small screens, a different experience than holding paper, but one that democratized access to materials that might otherwise be restricted. After the Second World War, a surge in higher education enrollment, fueled by programs like the GI Bill, created unprecedented demand for academic library resources. Universities expanded their collections aggressively, hired specialized librarians, built new facilities with open stacks allowing students to browse freely. The library became the intellectual heart of campus, the place where learning happened outside the classroom, where independent research began, where students discovered pathways into their disciplines. Photocopy technology, widely adopted by the 1960s, transformed research practices. Instead of laboriously transcribing passages, scholars could reproduce pages, build personal files of materials gathered from multiple sources. The implications for copyright and publishing would take decades to fully work out, but the immediate effect was to accelerate the pace of research, to enable forms of comparative analysis that required simultaneous access to numerous texts. Interlibrary loan networks expanded dramatically, enabled by improved cataloging standards and communication technologies. A book unavailable at one institution could be requested from another, shipped, borrowed for a limited period, returned, researchers in small colleges gained access to materials held only at major universities. Scholars anywhere could pursue questions requiring obscure sources. The collective resources of the library system became, in theory, if not always smoothly in practice, available to any serious researcher. Computerization arrived gradually, initially in back-office operations, catalog records converted to machine-readable format, circulation systems tracking loans and returns electronically, inventory management, acquisitions, all the administrative functions that kept libraries operating. The transition required enormous effort. Decades of catalog cards representing millions of items had to be converted to digital records, standardized, entered into databases, but the potential was evident. Computers could search and sort and correlate in ways impossible with physical systems. The Online Public Access Catalog, the OPAC, began replacing card catalogs in the 1980s. Terminals, where users could search the collection by author, title, subject, keyword, Boolean operators allowing complex queries, finding all books by a particular author on a specific topic published after a certain year, searches that would have required consulting multiple card drawers and cross-referencing entries, now completed in seconds, and the catalog could show not just whether the library owned an item, but whether it was currently available, where it was located, when it was due back if checked out. But something was lost in the transition. The serendipity of the card catalog, the adjacent cards noticed while searching for a specific entry, the handwritten annotations librarians sometimes added, the physical trace of use, worn cards for popular items, the sensory experience of working with a tangible system, these became nostalgia, memories of a way of doing things that seemed charmingly antiquated, even to those who had relied upon it. The Internet arrived not as library technology, but as something parallel, potentially competitive. Suddenly, information was available outside institutional frameworks. Anyone with network access could find facts, read news, communicate with others. The early utopian rhetoric suggested libraries might become obsolete. Why maintain expensive buildings and collections when everything would soon be digitized and freely available online? But librarians understood what enthusiasts sometimes missed, that information abundance creates its own challenges, that findability and reliability are not guaranteed by mere availability, that curation and organization remain essential, that not everything would be digitized, not everything should be, that physical materials and digital resources could coexist, serving different needs, different uses. The shift toward digital collections accelerated through the 1990s and into the new millennium. Academic journals moving online, databases of articles searchable from any networked computer, ebooks emerging as an alternative format, though adoption remained slower than predicted. Digitization projects like Google Books attempting to scan millions of volumes, creating searchable full-text repositories, raising complex questions about copyright and access and preservation, libraries adapted by becoming hybrid spaces, physical collections supplemented by licensed digital resources, reference librarians helping users navigate both print indices and online databases, computer terminals joining reading tables, Wi-Fi networks enabling researchers to bring their own devices. The library building transformed from being primarily a warehouse for books into a multifunctional learning and community space. Public libraries especially embraced this expanded role, offering not just books but internet access for those without home connections, digital literacy training, job search assistance, meeting rooms for community groups, programming for children and teens, maker spaces with three-dimensional printers and recording equipment, homework, help, and ESL classes. The library became a democratic technology center, an educational hub. A third place, neither home nor work, where people could gather, learn, access resources and opportunities. The physical book persisted despite predictions of its demise. Readers discovered that different formats suited different purposes. E-books convenient for travel. Physical books preferred for sustained reading, for books meant to be kept and reread, for the pleasure of browsing shelves. And libraries continued acquiring both, balancing user preferences with budget constraints, preservation responsibilities with demand for new materials, challenges mounted, budgets stagnating or declining even as costs increased. Journal subscriptions consuming ever larger portions of academic library budgets, forcing cancellations, limiting access. Public libraries facing pressure to demonstrate value in quantifiable terms, circulation statistics and program attendance becoming measures of success in ways that perhaps missed the less tangible but equally important roles libraries played. Yet the fundamental purpose remained: connecting people with knowledge, with information, with stories and ideas, and the accumulated understanding of human culture. The formats changed, the technologies evolved, the specific services adapted to community needs, but the core mission persisted across millennia. From clay tablets in Mesopotamian palace archives to digitized manuscripts accessible from anywhere with internet connection, the library endured as an institution dedicated to preservation, organization, access, and in an age of information overload, when search engines return millions of results in milliseconds, when anyone can publish anything online without editorial oversight or fact-checking, when algorithmic recommendations create filter bubbles and echo chambers, the library's curatorial function gained new relevance. Librarians as guides through information chaos, helping users evaluate sources, distinguish reliable from unreliable, develop critical literacy skills essential for navigating the contemporary information landscape. Special collections and archives found new audiences through digitization, rare manuscripts viewable online by researchers who could never visit in person, historical photographs discoverable through keyword searches, oral history recordings preserved and made accessible. The work of digitization, labor-intensive and expensive, requiring careful handling of fragile materials, high-resolution scanning, metadata creation, but resulting in dramatic expansion of who could access these unique resources. Indigenous communities and former colonies began reclaiming knowledge, seeking return of cultural materials held in distant libraries, or at a minimum requesting consultation and shared stewardship, raising important questions about ownership, about whose stories get told and who controls access, about the colonial histories embedded in many great collections, challenging institutions to examine their practices and relationships with source communities. The library building itself remained important, not as the sole point of access, but as physical manifestation of community commitment to learning, to literacy, to democratic values. The Carnegie libraries that had served small towns for a century needed updating. Some were renovated, repurposed, a few, sadly, demolished. But many communities fought to preserve them, recognizing them as architectural landmarks and symbols of civic pride. New library buildings incorporated design elements addressing contemporary needs, flexible spaces that could be reconfigured, technology infrastructure built into the architecture, accessibility for users with disabilities, sustainable building practices, natural light and comfortable seating, cafes and group study rooms, acknowledging that learning is often social, sound-dampened quiet zones for those needing silence, attempts to create welcoming environments that serve diverse user populations and multiple purposes simultaneously. The librarian's role continued evolving, traditional skills in cataloging and reference work, supplemented by expertise in digital resources, data management, information literacy instruction, community engagement, scholarly communication, the profession requiring continuous learning, adaptation to new technologies and changing user needs, while maintaining core commitments to intellectual freedom, privacy, equitable access. Principles that took on new urgency in digital contexts where surveillance and data collection were ubiquitous. And through all these changes, through format shifts and technological disruption, through budget crises and existential questions about relevance, libraries persisted, adapted, found ways to remain essential to the communities they served, because the need they addressed was fundamental: the human hunger for knowledge, for stories, for connection to ideas and to each other through the medium of a shared culture. These needs transcended any particular technology or format, any specific organizational system or service model. The question was never whether libraries would survive, but how they would evolve, what forms they would take, what services they would offer, and the answer emerged through experimentation, through listening to communities, through librarians' creativity and commitment, through recognition that the institution's strength lay not in any single function, but in its adaptability, its capacity to meet changing needs while maintaining fidelity to enduring values. The deeper pattern reveals itself slowly, like a constellation emerging as eyes adjust to darkness. Libraries have never been merely buildings filled with books. They have been theaters of transformation, spaces where individuals encounter ideas that reshape understanding, where communities maintain continuity across generations, where the possible expands beyond the boundaries of immediate experience. Consider what happens in the silence of sustained reading, the peculiar intimacy of engaging with another mind across distance, across time, the author perhaps long dead, the reader not yet born when the words were written. Yet in the act of reading, a connection forms. Thoughts conceived in one consciousness reconstitute themselves in another, not perfectly, never identically, but recognizably, meaningfully, and the library is the vessel that makes this encounter possible. The architecture of knowledge takes unexpected forms, the way subjects once considered separate reveal connections, mathematics illuminating music theory, biology informing philosophy, poetry capturing truths that elude scientific description, and the library organized by classification schemes, by subject headings and call numbers, paradoxically enables these discoveries, because proximity on shelves creates adjacencies in thought. The browser seeking one book notices another, follows an unexpected thread, emerges hours later having learned something they did not know they wanted to understand. There is democracy in alphabetical order, in systems that organize by topic rather than by the status of authors, in open stacks where anyone can wander, retrieve materials without intermediary. The physical act of pulling a book from a shelf, a small assertion of intellectual agency, the choice to engage, to pursue curiosity, to grant oneself permission to learn, and libraries multiply these moments millions of times over. Quiet affirmations that knowledge belongs to whoever seeks it. The preservation function operates on temporal scales difficult for individuals to comprehend. Librarians today making decisions about what future generations will have access to, which voices will be heard a century hence, which perspectives preserved, which allowed to fade. The responsibility is profound. The choice is consequential, and yet must be made. Budgets are finite, space limited, selection inevitable. And so the work proceeds with as much care and foresight as can be mustered, knowing that some part of the present will become invisible to the future despite best efforts. Digital preservation presents challenges even more complex than conserving paper and ink. File formats become obsolete, software unreadable on new systems, websites disappear, entire archives evaporating when servers fail or companies cease operations. The paradox that information in the most technologically advanced formats may prove least durable over centuries, while medieval manuscripts on vellum remain readable after half a millennium. The solutions require ongoing active maintenance, migration from old formats to new, redundant storage, institutional commitment across decades, work that must continue indefinitely or risk catastrophic loss. The social space of libraries matters in ways not fully captured by circulation statistics. The student who has no quiet place to study at home, finding sanctuary in the reading room. The elderly patron who comes primarily for human contact, brief friendly exchanges with staff, the presence of others engaged in their own pursuits, the homeless individual seeking shelter and dignity in a space that offers both without demanding anything in return, the library as refuge, as third place, as location where one can simply be without commercial transaction or social obligation. Children's relationship with libraries often forms early and stays deeply rooted. The excitement of getting a first library card, name written in careful letters, the power it represents, access to thousands of books, the freedom to choose, to take them home, story hours where librarians read aloud, voices animated, children sprawled on carpet, transported by narrative, summer reading programs, the joy of selecting armfuls of books, the weight of possibility, and sometimes, for some children, the library becomes the place where love of reading takes hold, where worlds beyond immediate circumstances become visible, imaginable, where futures other than predetermined paths suggest themselves. The reference interview, that conversational dance between librarian and patron, reveals human dimension of information seeking, the question asked often not quite the question meant, the skilled librarian listening beneath the words, clarifying, suggesting, understanding that information need is rarely simple retrieval, more often a complex negotiation with uncertainty, a groping toward understanding not yet fully formed, And the good librarian helps navigate that uncertainty, offers pathways, resources, next steps, without judgment, without assumption, meeting the questioner where they are. Academic libraries witness the formation of expertise. Undergraduate students learning to move beyond textbooks and lectures into primary sources, grappling with scholarly discourse, beginning to contribute their own ideas. Graduate students spending years in carols and reading rooms, developing arguments, marshalling evidence. The dissertation that represents original contribution to knowledge often built from countless hours among the stacks. And the library holds all of this, the finished scholarship and the process, the published works and the archival materials that document how understanding advances through patient accumulation. Special collections preserve the ephemeral, letters and diaries, drafts and revisions, the working materials that show how creation actually happens, the false starts and crossed out lines, and these materials humanize the canonical, show writers and thinkers as people who struggled, who doubted, whose finished works represent choices among possibilities, and researchers in these collections often seek not just information but connection, intimacy with the creative process, insight into how ideas develop. Indigenous knowledge traditions pose important questions about library practices. Oral cultures where knowledge lives in performance and relationship, where context and ceremony matter, where some knowledge is restricted, not meant for general access, and Western library models built on principles of universal access and permanent preservation sometimes clash with these epistemologies, requiring institutions to develop new approaches, collaborative practices, recognition that stewardship takes different forms, that preservation and access must sometimes be balanced differently. The pandemic of 2020 revealed library importance through absence, buildings closed, physical materials inaccessible, and while many services moved online, digital reference and virtual programming and expanded ebook lending, something essential was lost. The place itself, the browsing, the chance encounters, the public computing, the after-school programs, the simple opportunity to be among others in a shared space dedicated to learning, and the eagerness with which communities returned when reopening became possible spoke to needs libraries meet that extend beyond information provision. Banned books and challenges to materials reveal ongoing tensions about library values, intellectual freedom, clashing with desires to protect or control what others, especially children, encounter, librarians defending principles of access, arguing that exposure to diverse perspectives strengthens rather than threatens, that individuals and families can make their own choices without imposing restrictions on others. The library as battleground for competing visions of what society should be, what knowledge should be available, who decides looking across millennia, from clay tablets to digital databases. The continuity seems more significant than the changes. Yes, technologies transform, scales shift, access expands, but the fundamental human activities remain: seeking knowledge, preserving understanding, organizing information, making it findable, connecting people with ideas. These impulses ancient as civilization itself, and likely to persist as long as humans wonder, question, desire to know. The future remains uncertain. Artificial intelligence and machine learning promising and threatening disruption, questions about library roles, when algorithms can retrieve information, when chatbots can answer questions. But the wise remember that technology has always posed such challenges, and libraries have always adapted, found new ways to remain relevant, because the core need is human, the hunger for understanding, for growth, for connection to accumulated wisdom, and these needs transcend any particular technological moment. Perhaps what libraries ultimately preserve is possibility, the possibility that anyone, regardless of background or circumstance, might encounter an idea that transforms understanding, might discover a passion, might develop expertise, might contribute to the ongoing conversation that is human culture. The library says, in its existence, in its openness, that this possibility is worth protecting, worth investing in, worth maintaining for generation after generation. A faith in human potential, in the value of learning, in the importance of memory and access, and the free circulation of ideas. And so the work continues. Librarians cataloging new acquisitions, shelvers returning books to their proper places, reference specialists answering questions, archivists processing collections, preserving fragile materials, all in service of something larger than any individual, in service of the collective project of maintaining and extending human understanding, of ensuring that what we have learned, created, discovered, is not lost, but carried forward, made available, offered to whoever comes seeking. The buildings stand, some grand, some modest, some centuries old, some newly constructed, but all serving similar purposes, providing space for quiet concentration, for research and discovery, for learning and growth. Doorways open, welcoming, public in the deepest sense, belonging to everyone, excluding no one, asking nothing but curiosity, respect, the willingness to engage, and inside the volumes wait, millions of them, billions, knowledge accumulated across millennia, stories and data, poetry and science, history and speculation, voices of the famous and forgotten, all held, all organized, all theoretically accessible to whoever takes the time to look, to search, to follow threads of interest wherever they lead. It is an extraordinary gift, this inheritance, built by countless individuals across generations who believed that knowledge mattered, that preservation served the future, that access should be protected, defended, expanded whenever possible, who did the unglamorous work, the cataloging and conservation, the reference service and collection development, because they understood themselves as links in a chain extending backward to ancient Alexandria and forward to generations unborn. The library endures, adapting, evolving, meeting new challenges, embracing new possibilities, but always maintaining fidelity to core purposes, always serving those fundamental human needs that transcend era or technology, the need to know, to remember, to learn from those who came before, to imagine what might come after, and in that endurance, in that persistence across centuries of change, there is something profoundly hopeful, a statement of faith in human curiosity, in the value of learning, in the possibility of understanding, in the importance of maintaining spaces, physical and institutional, where knowledge can be freely sought, freely shared, freely given to all who hunger for it. The silence of the reading room, the rustle of turn-in pages, the soft keyboard clicks, the whispered question at the reference desk. These sounds of minds at work, engaged, seeking, all part of a tradition older than most institutions, more enduring than empires, the human project of gathering what we know, organizing it, preserving it, offering it forward, generation to generation, an endless conversation, a collective memory, a gift renewed with each person who enters, each question asked, each discovery made, each moment of understanding achieved in the quiet sanctuary of accumulated human wisdom.